Well, good morning, everyone. Can I welcome you to the 20th meeting in 2013 of the Infrastructure and Capital Investment Committee. Can I remind everyone to switch off their mobile devices as they do affect the broadcasting system. However, having said that, some members will be consulting their tablets as we provide papers in digital format. Agenda item 1 is a decision on taking business in private, and I seek the agreement of the committee to take agenda item 4 in private to allow the committee to consider evidence from the Cabinet Secretary on the draft budget 2014-15 and also to take its future consideration of the draft budget report in private. Are members agreed? That is agreed. Thank you. The second item is to hear evidence from the Cabinet Secretary and Scottish Government officials on the Scottish Government's draft budget 2014-15 as part of the committee's scrutiny process. This year, the committee has adopted a different approach. Rather than focusing on specific aspects of the draft budget, the committee has conducted a wider evaluation of the Scottish Government's performance in delivering its priorities as set out in the 2011 spending review in those areas which fall within the committee's remit. Having said that, I suspect there will be specific questions on some details of the draft budget. So can I now welcome the witnesses Nicola Sturgeon, Cabinet Secretary for Infrastructure, Investment and Cities, Bill Byron, Head of Investment and Local Strategies Group Housing Supply Division, Janet Edgedale, Deputy Director, Infrastructure and Investment Unit, and Sharon Fairweather, Director, Finance from Transport Scotland. Cabinet Secretary, would you like to make some opening remarks?
Yeah, thanks very much, Convener, and thanks to the committee for giving me the opportunity to be here this morning. As we've just heard the Convener outline, I know that the committee's scrutiny this year is concentrating on evaluating the Government's performance in delivering our purpose and strategic priorities through how our national indicators perform and through the progress made towards meeting our 7 high-level purpose targets. Over the next 2 years, as has been the case in past years, we will seek to ensure that we are equipped to deliver the outcomes, the objectives and priorities that are set out in the programme for government, the Government's economic strategy and the National Performance Framework. Our draft budget sets out our proposals for using the resources we have at our disposal to deliver our purpose. We'll invest to support economic recovery, create jobs, boost housing and continue progress towards a low-carbon economy. We'll provide record numbers of apprenticeships, support small businesses, deliver free higher education and protect household incomes through the social wage and the continuation of the council tax freeze. There are some signs, and there's no room for complacency, but there are some emerging signs that the investment decisions the Government is taking and the policies we are pursuing are beginning to work. So we see Scottish GDP statistics showing annual growth of 1.2% compared to 0.3% for the UK as a whole. We've seen employment rise by 45,000 over the year and our employment rate of 72.4%, sitting higher than the UK employment rate of 71.6%. Unemployment is down 19,000. Our unemployment rate is 7.4%. Is slightly lower than the UK's 7.7%, and we've seen a fall in youth unemployment of 12,000 over the year and a youth employment rate that is now higher than the corresponding rate across the UK. So there are some signs of progress, but of course there is absolutely no room for complacency. That's why our spending plans remain very focused on accelerating economic recovery through investment. We have an investment programme of more than £8 billion over the next 2 years. That is estimated to support 50,000 full-time equivalent jobs across Scotland. It is, as the committee is well aware, estimated that each additional £100 million of public sector capital spending supports around £160 million in output in the wider economy, and investment of that scale is estimated to support around 1,300 full-time equivalent jobs, around 60% of which will be in construction. We're also seeking to improve our measurement of community benefits, such as youth employment all the time. And to address the cuts to our core capital budget that we've seen in recent times, we're switching funding from resource to capital. We're utilising capital receipts, pursuing revenue-funded investment through the NPD programme and the regulatory asset base rail enhancements. And we're doing all of that while committing no more than 5% of our future total DEL budget on the cost of our revenue-funded investment programme. Some of our major infrastructure projects are showing signs of real progress. The Queensferry Crossing, which will be delivered on time and within a cost estimate that since 2011 has reduced by £145 million. Work continues again on time and on budget on the New South Glasgow Hospitals project, and major refurbishment programmes across the health service. The Schools for the Future programme will deliver 67 new schools across Scotland, 11 of which are already complete and operational. And construction, as the committee is aware, is underway on Glasgow and Inverness colleges. On housing, very briefly, the budget enables us to deliver on our very important commitment to provide 30,000 new affordable homes over the life of the Parliament. Since the publication of the 2013-14 draft budget, the Housing and Regeneration budget has been augmented, and in September this year, we also announced a reallocation of £10 million from fuel poverty budgets to create a fund for local authorities to spend to mitigate the impact of the bedroom tax, which brings the welfare imperative of the budget into focus. And finally, penultimately, convener on transport. Transport makes a significant contribution to our well-being as a country, both economically and socially and also environmentally. It's absolutely vital that we've got an efficient and sustainable transport system, both to increase sustainable economic growth and ensure that we're making progress towards a low-carbon economy. Since the spending review, the Government has allocated over £200 million to reduce the carbon impact of transport, and in current allocation plans, over £300 million will support low-carbon transport over 13-14 to 15-16. And finally, Scottish Water, also extremely important. In the next 2 financial years, Scottish Water will continue to deliver the improvements that are required of it by ministers. In 2014-15, Scottish Water plans to deliver the improvements to our water and sewerage services as set out in its delivery plan and agreed with ministers, and the improvements for 15-16 will be agreed in 2014 as part of the process to determine customer charges for the next regulatory period of 2015 to 2021. So that very quick overview, convener, I hope is helpful to the committee in setting the general context for our discussions this morning, but I look forward to getting into more detail as you ask the questions that are important.
Thank you very much, Cabinet Secretary. And if I can start on the on some questions around the progress on the purpose targets. To what extent is the National Performance Framework and the purpose targets, in particular, used as a decision-making mechanism to determine or prioritise policy and budgets across government and within your portfolio? Is it target-driven, given what the frameworks that you work under?
Yeah, I mean, the National Performance Framework is, and the purpose of the government and the purpose targets is an important tool in guiding the decision-making we take as a government overall and decision-making in individual portfolios. If you look at the purpose and the national outcomes, they're very much a vision and a description of the type of country we want to create. So they set the strategic direction for the government and therefore guide the decisions that advance that strategic direction. And the budget, not just in this portfolio, but the budget across all portfolios, reflects that strategic direction very much. And if you look specifically at the infrastructure investment portfolio and our spending plans, the ways in which they support the delivery of the national outcomes are set out in the form of a strategic overview in the portfolio chapter of the budget. The Scotland Performs Indicator dashboard is how we then measure progress towards that vision and that strategic direction that we set, and that is intended to be a snapshot of how Scotland is doing as a society and how we're measuring up to delivering that strategic vision. And the whole framework, if you like, provides a national stock take of how we're doing. So in that sense, it is an important tool in guiding the decisions we take, obviously in budgetary decisions, but more broadly than that in terms of setting our policy and setting our overall direction. I suppose the one caveat, and it's an important caveat I would make, it's not really a caveat, it's just to give further explanation and context. The Scotland Performs framework is predominantly made up of long-term outcome-focused indicators. There's some of the indicators that are about public perception and attitude. So these can necessarily and inevitably sometimes be at some distance from individual policy programmes and individual policy decisions. So it can sometimes be hard to absolutely draw a straight line between spend to outcomes, particularly as we're not just dealing sometimes with long-term outcomes, but also complex multi-year changes. So I think it's important to see the performance framework as that strategic direction underpinned by the indicators that allow us to measure progress. But I think the committee has to, and any committee has to take care in always thinking that you can draw a straight line between individual spending decisions and a particular outcome, just given the long-term and often complex nature of that. So I hope that tries to, or I hope that succeeds to some extent in giving some context to how the performance framework guides the decisions, budgetary and otherwise, that we take.
And how much of that is dependent on cross-departmental working, because you can't operate in a silo, and are there conflicts that arise because of discussions and things with other departments?
Never conflicts in these discussions. I mean, as the committee is very well aware, that the way our government is structured is designed to promote that cross-portfolio working. That is the whole point of the National Performance Framework. So, you have indicators across all of the different portfolios, but they're all working towards the delivery of that overarching purpose. So it forces joined up and integrated working. That's the whole intention of it. And as we discuss and finalise the budget as a government, then clearly individual ministers, individual cabinet secretaries have got particular responsibilities in their own portfolio areas. But as a whole, the cabinet, the government looks to make sure that the entirety of the budget is working towards the delivery of those outcomes and that purpose. And even if you look at some of the detail of my own portfolio, I mean, I can think just off the top of my head of two particular areas where, although responsibility sits in my portfolio and some of the funding sits in my portfolio, other portfolio areas are as important to the delivery of what we're trying to achieve. So digital infrastructure and digital participation, for example, is one example of that, and sustainable travel, cycling, those kind of things. Although the responsibility sits squarely within my portfolio, you see different budget lines contributing to that. So, there's very much a cross-portfolio, cross-government objective here behind meeting the overall objectives that we set.
And the Scottish Government has in place several mechanisms for getting high-level policy advice, the Council of Economic Advisers, the National Economic Forum and others. How are these bodies used to test progress against the purpose and targets, and do they influence resource allocations to help achieve progress?
I mean, these are all very important and very influential advisory groups. They will, discuss aspects of government policy, aspects of government performance on an ongoing basis. I suppose the kind of direct line that I would point to there is that these are advisory groups that very much help to develop and steer and measure progress against the government's economic strategy. The draft budget sets the spending plans that are about making sure that those spending plans are contributing to the delivery of the economic strategy, and then to go back to my commentary about the National Performance Framework, delivering the outcome of that. So it's, these are advisory groups that very much feed into that overall framework and our ability as a government to make sure. I mean, I'm sure we'll come on later on to talk about welfare. Welfare is a good example of spending decisions that I've had to take as a minister in recent times, which, will certainly contribute towards our overall purpose, but they have been driven by external factors that have necessitated decisions. So there will always be occasions where, as a government, you have to take decisions on that basis. But the whole point of having the framework and these advisory groups that feed into that is that wherever possible, the decisions that we are taking are about contributing to a bigger picture.
Okay, thanks. Gordon.
Okay, thanks, Convener. The Scottish economy saw its fourth consecutive quarter of GDP growth in Q2, including 2% growth in construction. And in your opening remarks, you highlighted that Scotland is achieving a higher growth rate than the rest of the UK. Do you think the government is on target to achieve to match the GDP growth rate of small independent EU countries by 2017? And what has your portfolio contributed towards that?
Well, as I indicated in my opening remarks, the recent GDP statistics have given some cause for optimism. Our target is to match the UK. I gave the year statistics that show that we have exceeded the UK growth rate. We've still got work to do to match the growth over a long period of other comparable countries elsewhere. So I think we've got reason to, as I said, be optimistic about that, but I don't think we should be at all complacent. The economy is showing signs of recovery, but I think most people who would comment on this would still point to the fragility of that recovery and the need to remain very focused on doing everything possible to support it and underpin it and give it more momentum. In terms of the infrastructure portfolio, I think it plays a significant part in making sure that we have seen that recovery and growth and that we will continue to. I mentioned statistics in my opening remarks around the fact that every £100 million of capital investment will deliver £160 million in economic output, will deliver a number of in excess of 1,000 jobs. So I don't think you can underestimate it. It's been a key and recurring theme of the Scottish Government's narrative around economic recovery is the importance of capital investment to kickstart and then give momentum to recovery. So I think what we've seen so far would suggest that the things that we have tried to do have been the right things, but we need to keep doing them and we need to do them as much as possible.
In light that we need to do as much as possible, the Scotland Act in 2012 gave the Scottish Government the ability to borrow up to £296 million in 25-16. To what extent will this borrowing facility be used and how will it support growth in the economy? Well,
we intend to make maximum use of our ability to invest in capital infrastructure. I mentioned in my opening remarks the 5% rule that we need to keep our overall revenue commitments to within that 5% limit, and our decisions are geared to ensuring that we can do that. But I suppose my answer to this question relates very firmly back to my answer to your last question, is that yes, we're seeing encouraging signs in the economy, but there is absolutely no excuse for taking the foot off the gas. We've got very limited and constrained we will have when the new borrowing powers come into force. They will still be very limited and constrained, but I think the people of Scotland will be looking to us to make sure that we maximise our ability to invest, and we will be doing that. But we will do it in a way that is responsible and sustainable, unlike I might venture sort of previous governments around FI and PPP. We need to ensure that the decisions we are taking around investment are not overburdening governments in years to come with unsustainable revenue commitments. So that's why that 5% discipline is important.
Now, you said that every £100 million of investment creates 1,000 jobs, and there is a suggestion that the purpose target dealing with cohesion shows a worsening performance due to a reduction in the employment rate in 3 of the worst performing areas. To what extent does your portfolio have a role in addressing this through transport, housing, digital, etc.? And have you adjusted your spend to assist these areas?
I think it just might be worth kind of focusing for a couple of seconds on, I think you were referring to the cohesion target there, which is showing, it's one of the small number of targets that's showing a worsening performance right now. It just might be worth focusing on the reason for that. And the increased gap in performance there has been driven by a reduction in the employment rate for the worst 3 performing regions in the country, a reduction in the employment rate that is higher in the reduction in the employment rate for the best 3 performing areas in the country. So that has resulted in a widening gap. Answer to the rest of your question in 2 parts, really. My portfolio has got a big role to play in trying to deal with that for 2 reasons. One, the overall investment in capital infrastructure that I've spoken about. For every 100 million, it's about 1,300 jobs. Every 100 million is estimated to support. The regeneration part of my portfolio has got a big part to play there as well, because our regeneration spend is very specifically targeted at areas of multiple deprivation. So that overall construction, coupled with the focus on regeneration, means that we've got a very big part to play. And if I can just give you one example, the New Glasgow College, one of the NPD projects that is in construction, is expected to create 170 new jobs during construction, 40 modern apprenticeships and lots of work experience opportunities. Now that's in the city of Glasgow, one of the more deprived parts of the country. So that's a good example of capital investment and regeneration working hand in hand. Overall, obviously, we've put a very strong emphasis on job creation, particularly around youth employment, and our commitments around youth employment guarantee, the modern apprenticeships, record number of modern apprenticeships, will also contribute to making sure that we are doing the things needed to bring our performance on that target back to where we would want it to be. Obviously, the overall and prevailing economic conditions bear heavily on targets like that, but nevertheless we are focused on using the powers and resources we've got to have as much influence on that as possible.
Thanks very much.
Okay, thank you. Jim, you next, sorry.
Thank you, Convener, and good morning, Cabinet Secretary. If we can get the easy questions out of the way first. There is a suggestion that for all governments there is a need to balance conflicting and competing objectives. And you said in your opening remarks that government has a commitment to promote economic recovery and also a low-carbon economy, but sometimes, arguably, those objectives come into there's a tension. We won't go as far as to say conflict. So government is committed to Aberdeen Western Peripheral Road, Queensferry Crossing. Those are clearly examples of capital investment driving economic recovery. But of course, the government's own document, RPP2, tells us that 75% of transport emissions are generated on our roads. So do you have a sense in which there are tensions between competing objectives, and how does government resolve those when making expenditure and investment decisions?
Was that you saying that was the easy question?
Yes.
Yeah, okay. I look forward to what's coming next. I always hesitate to use the word tension because it always sounds a bit more pejorative than you would want it. All governments have to balance, costs and benefits, risks, etc., and make sure that in their overall approach to government, they're striking as far as you ever can the right balance between competing priorities. The scenario you've outlined in your question there is no different. I mean, in terms of transport, and you make a very valid and very important point about the contribution of transport to meeting our overall climate change and carbon reduction targets. Transport Scotland itself makes an assessment of changes in emissions as part of their standard transport appraisal process, and the carbon account for transport reports these for all major programmes. So there's clearly a very keen focus on that as we plan and take decisions around major transport projects. I think the other point I would make, though, is a slightly wider point, which is that our strategic investment in, say, the road transport network can ultimately and does ultimately support the low-carbon agenda. Whether that's providing better links for efficient public transport, or providing the infrastructure you need for the new generation of low-carbon vehicles, whether it's taking traffic off of local roads. I think while we absolutely have to be very serious about making sure that the decisions that we're taking around big transport projects are absolutely guided by that appraisal process that I spoke about, I think it would be wrong simply to see road programmes as bad for that agenda because they often contribute to that agenda if you plan properly and take the right factors into account. So I wouldn't describe it so much as a tension as more a necessity and an imperative to properly balance those sometimes competing priorities.
Okay, that was helpful. One of the things you mentioned was the difficulties in drawing a line between government spend and outcomes. But actually, there are some examples where it's possible to do that, and I'm thinking here specifically of energy efficiency, home insulation, and the investment the government has made in that direction. I understand that between 2002 and 2011, there has been an increase in the number of homes that are energy efficient, to the extent that we now have 65% of homes in Scotland that now have a good energy efficiency rating. So, with that in mind, and given that there remain challenges around home insulation, I think there's still 500,000 homes that would benefit from insulation by having solid walls. How reassured are you that within the economic and financial constraints that government is committing sufficient resource to meet those objectives?
We are, in my view, committing very strongly to the objective of making sure that our homes are as energy efficient as possible. Our home energy efficiency programmes, which encapsulate 3 different programmes, our area-based scheme, affordable warmth and the energy assistance package, will be taking all of the funding sources for that together, programmes in excess of £200 million a year. Around £70 million going up next year to £79 million of that is direct government investment. Now, I'm not getting into a kind of inter-government competition here. I simply see this as an observation. We're continuing to ensure direct government investment in these programmes. In England, the UK government is having all of these programmes reliant on funding from the energy companies. So I think that in itself gives an indication of the priority and the importance we attach to home energy efficiency for a variety of reasons. For the reason that you mentioned the contribution transport makes to cutting carbon emissions. Housing is another big contributor, so we need to make sure that we are focusing as hard as we can on that. But also, the more energy efficient homes are, then the lower people can keep their energy bills, which is obviously a key concern at the moment. Now, I spoke last week about if we had full powers here of how we would want to fund these things differently in order to take the pressure off of household energy bills. But nevertheless, the way that we are committing to these schemes at the moment is, I think, an important indicator of the importance. You're absolutely right to point to the progress that has been made, not just by this government, by predecessor governments as well, but we've still got lots of work to do, and I think it's important that we ensure the right levels of funding to achieve that.
The RPP2 document, which the government published, has an estimate of the costs of delivering carbon emission reductions for housing of £517 million in 2014 and £524 million in 2015. I'm just interested to know how you arrive at decisions around which policy levers or budgets to use when you're seeking to obtain these objectives.
I suppose the first point I would make about the figures you've cited there, which are, you're absolutely right, are the figures cited in RPP2. These are figures for the whole of society, the estimates that are deemed that we need to spend to meet our targets. They're not just figures for government spend, so they would encapsulate spending by local government, by the wider public sector, by private individuals. Meeting climate change targets and carbon reduction targets are that's something that is a shared agenda. It's not just for government. Government's obviously got a big part to play in making sure we meet that. And, our decisions, I spoke in my answer to your earlier question about the home energy efficiency programme. So that's one very concrete example of how we take spending decisions that are specifically geared towards meeting particular objectives there. And that's a significant sum of money, part funded by us, part funded by the energy companies. Over the 3-year period, we're going to spend about £250 million just as government on fuel poverty and energy efficiency. You've then got low carbon transport budgets. So, we, as I said earlier on, you can't always draw a straight line between a budget decision and one of the outcomes. But you're absolutely right. In this area, it is much easier to do that. So all of these decisions are very much geared towards meeting the indicators in the performance framework, but also the challenges set down in RPP2 as well.
Thank you.
Alex?
Thank you very much, Convener. I wanted to move on to the subject of digital infrastructure and digital economy. And the budget line for this in this year's budget shows a small rise. Could the Minister or could the Cabinet Secretary outline the rationale for the budget line this year?
The budget line in the infrastructure portfolio for digital, the rise, and that's quite a small rise in that budget line, reflects the allocation of capital consequentials in 2014-15, which will be utilised to deliver the digital infrastructure as part of the Next Generation Digital Fund, the bulk of which sits within the Rural Affairs and Environment portfolio, principally because much of the impact and much of the benefit of that programme is felt in rural areas. So the small increase there is a contribution towards that, which comes from capital consequentials.
Clarify what you expect to achieve with the resource that's allocated within your budget line.
Well, we would contribute towards, our whole step change infrastructure programme is delivering, as you know, the next generation broadband infrastructure across the Highlands and Islands project and the rest of Scotland project. Both of those contracts now let BT working on them. There's rollout plans being prepared as we speak at the moment for that. So the funding in my portfolio very much contributes to that overall programme.
The measure selected as the national indicator for digital infrastructure, does it sufficiently disaggregate and give meaningful information about what you're achieving?
Again, it kind of, I suppose, goes back a little bit to my answer to the convener's first question. Scotland Performs provides a strategic direction for policy making, not just in government but across the public sector, and provides a direction to move us to outcomes-based policy interventions, and that's as true in terms of digital as it is in any other aspect of policy making. If you look at the indicators in the performance framework, the Improve Digital Infrastructure indicator measures the proportion of both residential and non-residential premises that are within postcodes where next generation broadband is available. So it's that indicator that we use to measure our progress towards the overall objective in the performance framework. We use their Ofcom data along with data that local authorities and commercial companies provide that then help us also to identify the intervention areas for the step change programme. So, again, it's a strategic direction in the performance framework, and the indicators are how we measure progress, in this case, specifically the indicator around improving digital infrastructure.
You say that the indicators allow you to measure progress. Do they adequately assist in making decisions and prioritising within budgets this year and going forward?
Yes, and I think the question is obviously specifically about digital here. What I've said there is in terms of the indicator measures the proportion of premises that have access to next generation, and we're using the available data to identify the intervention areas for the step change programme to understand and allow us to model likely coverage levels of that. So there's a very kind of direct sense there in which the way in which the resources for that programme are being allocated in terms of the actual areas that are driven by the data that underpins the performance framework here?
I think we all instinctively talk about budgets in relation to the provision of physical infrastructure. But one of the things that this committee has become aware of over time, and has become an increasing problem, is that you can provide the physical infrastructure and it may not actually be used. We've heard from academics, for example, who say that while the infrastructure is important, its use, or the use to which it's put, the effective connectivity is what drives outcomes. So is the Cabinet Secretary content that enough is being done to help, for example, SME businesses to reach and hard to reach individuals to make best use of the infrastructure that's being made available?
I am absolutely of the view that we are, increasingly mindful of the need to do that, and I'll run through in a second some of the things we're doing to make sure we're focusing as much as we need to on that. I think you're right that much of the discussion we've had around digital in Scotland to date has been around infrastructure, and there's a very good reason for that, in that the infrastructure has been lacking, and therefore it's very difficult to get into a meaningful discussion with people about participation if they don't have the infrastructure to make that realistic for them. So I think it's been the right focus of government to deal with the infrastructure problem. Now that we have the step change programmes in place, though, and the infrastructure increasingly is going to be there, and I don't underestimate that there will continue to be parts of the country where infrastructure remains a real challenge, but nevertheless the step change programme will make a step change, a significant step change in the provision of infrastructure. We've got to get to a stage, and we're trying to get to a stage, where we encourage people to take the infrastructure for granted and switch the discussion much more to digital participation. And that is digital participation by individuals in their everyday lives, as well as by small businesses. And in terms of the economic advantages of this, there are massive economic advantages to small businesses in using the internet much more as part of their daily business needs and requirements. But there's also massive economic impact in terms of encouraging businesses to get in there and provide the applications and such like that will allow us to take advantage of the infrastructure. So increasingly we're focusing on that side of it as we move towards having the infrastructure bit of it in much better shape. We've done a number of things. We're putting in place a number of things at the moment. We've appointed a Director of Digital Participation in partnership with SCVO that takes up post in the next few weeks to try to reinvigorate this agenda. We've published already Scotland's Digital Future, which is setting out proposals to build on what we're doing just now and better support businesses in particular to make the most of the infrastructure that will be in place. We've announced earlier this year £7 million to implement the recommendations of that report and complement the resources that are already in place, working with Scottish Enterprise, with Highlands and Islands Enterprise. We've established a Digital Scotland Business Excellence Partnership. So there's a whole work programme there to make sure that we don't just have the infrastructure in place, but that individuals and businesses are equipped to take best advantage of that infrastructure. If this is an area that the committee is interested in, I can provide much more detail around the participation side of it in writing, if that would be helpful.
Thank you very much.
If we move on to water now, Adam, you've got some questions.
Thank you, Convener. Could I ask the Cabinet Secretary why water is not specifically mentioned in the National Performance Framework, which is surprising given the importance that's given to the hydro-nation concept and all the opportunities that are opening up to make Scotland perhaps a world leader in some technical innovation, some of the marketing possibilities that we have. And is that not downplaying and perhaps demotivating the sector?
The fact that the sector Scottish Water as an organisation in the sector is not specifically mentioned. There are other sectors and organisations. I mean, there are no particular organisations mentioned in the performance framework. So the absence of a specific mention should not in any way, shape or form be taken to mean that we don't understand and appreciate and want to build on the contribution that Scottish Water and the water sector generally has to make in fulfilling some of the objectives in the National Performance Framework. I mean, if you look down the list of indicators, for example, you'll see a number that the activities of Scottish Water will directly contribute towards achieving. So the importance of Scottish Water, I wouldn't want to understate, and I don't think it's possible to overstate it. I think we've seen the evidence of that in the last year or so around the passage of the Water Resources Bill, the development of the hydronation agenda, all contributing not just to making sure that Scottish Water continues to perform as it does just now, as a very, very well-performing water company in public hands. I'm delighted and proud to say, for the benefit of at least one member of this committee, but that we harness and make use of our abundant water resource more generally. So, Scottish Water and the water sector is very, very important. It's a sector in Scotland we should be really proud of and should be determined to maximise, and we are through the agendas that I've already spoken about.
Okay. Now, the regulatory period, the current regulatory period ends in 2015, and the Output Monitoring Group has reported regularly on agreed measures and targets which we have heard described as delivering traditional services from Scottish Water. Can Scottish Water deliver more to the purpose and purpose targets, and will there be changes to the monitoring regime for the new regulatory period up to 2021 to reflect that?
Two or three different parts to that question. Can Scottish Water deliver more? Scottish Water is an organisation that has, over the past number of years, it seems to me, operated in the way of always trying to up its game and deliver more. I think it's been extremely successful in doing that. I say that as a constituency MSP whose large part of our constituency was without water last night as a result of a burst water main, so I should bear that in mind when I'm answering this question. But Scottish Water has always taken the view that it should seek to maximise its performance. So the short answer to the question is I'm sure it can do more, and it will be at the front of the queue in trying to make sure it does more. I mentioned the hydronation agenda, and it's very committed to that and very excited about the opportunities of that. The second bit of your question was really about the monitoring arrangements that are in place to make sure that Scottish Water is delivering on the objectives we set for it. The Output Monitoring Group was set up specifically to monitor the delivery of Scottish Water's investment programme and also to ensure that customers receive the improvements in services that they're paying for through their water bills. In my estimation, and as a minister that's been responsible for Scottish Water now for just over a year, I think that monitoring framework works very well. So I've got no plans to change the monitoring framework. In terms of the content of the objectives that we set for Scottish Water, though, as you know and as you alluded to in your question, there's work underway just now to finalise the investment requirements and customer charges for the next regulatory period. And those discussions in setting that for the 2015-21 period involve discussions on the targets and monitoring arrangements that we set for Scottish Water. So it's a very live discussion in that sense. But overall, my view of Scottish Water is one of a very high-performing organisation. We've got average water bills now that are lower than average water bills in England, which is a huge success. It's an organisation that has challenged itself and continues to challenge itself, and we've got robust monitoring arrangements in place for it.
Can I finish with one specific question? A budget line, the Scottish Government has created a new applied research fund of £5 million. Could I ask what your objectives are for this research fund?
This is the fund that is specifically designed to support the hydronation programme of work which is associated with the bill that went through Parliament earlier this year. Yes. As you remember, because you were all involved in the passage of that bill, it places a duty on ministers to develop the value of our water resources. So the programme of work around the hydronation programme is designed to help us deliver on that duty. Some of the work that's in hand in terms of that budget line includes setting up a programme of postgraduate hydronation scholars to further develop our academic expertise. We're supporting new Scottish products to be tested and brought to market through the development of an innovation service, doing that in partnership with the enterprise agencies, and there's support also for climate justice projects in sub-Saharan Africa to help improve their access to water and sanitation. So that's the kind of work that this budget is supporting as part of that broader hydronation programme.
Thank you.
If we move on to housing, Mary.
Thank you, Convener. Looking at the purpose and the purpose target section of the National Performance Framework, there's little mention of housing in any of the pages of Scotland Performs. What's your view of the role that housing plays in delivering these high-level economic outcomes, and why is housing not specifically mentioned?
If you look at the National Performance Framework, I mean, one of the specific national outcomes is you know, we live in well-designed, sustainable places where we're able to access the amenities and services we need. I mean, that is not exclusively about housing, but, you know, housing is obviously centrally important to that outcome. There's two specific indicators in the suite of national indicators related to housing. The first of those is improve access to suitable housing options for those in housing need. There's about to be a refresh of the indicators. That clearly is one that is going to be specifically looked at in terms of the refresh, given that we've already specifically removed we've abolished the priority need distinction in homelessness, our approach to homelessness, so that one will be refreshed. The other indicator is to increase the number of new homes. So, you know, clearly there's a strong focus on housing in the framework, and rightly so. Firstly, to make sure that people have the homes they need to live in, but also housing, as this committee has discussed many times in the past and will no doubt do so in the future, the contribution of housing construction to the wider economy is very important as well. So I would argue that housing is well reflected in the performance framework, and I would also argue very strongly that the importance and priority we attach to housing is very well reflected in the budget and the budgetary decisions we're making.
Just to follow up on that answer, and it is right, housing plays a central role in the effect that housing has on other targets and how Scotland performs is crucial, because by putting more money into housing, you create jobs, you regenerate local economies, you regenerate local towns. It has an impact on health and well-being. So it is a crucial sector, and it is vitally important that it is given the importance, and it's reflected across those other budgets. So are you saying that it's adequately funded and there's adequate resources there?
I suppose, the first comment I would make is to absolutely agree with your analysis of the importance of housing, not just for its own sake, but in what it contributes more generally. Second contextual point I would just make, you know, just as a statement of fact, is, you know, obviously all of the budget decisions we take are constrained by the overall size of our budget. So there might be lots of things that I would like to be able to spend more money on if I had access to more money. But we have to, you know, constrain our decisions within the resources that are available to us. Within that, though, you know, as committee members are aware, we have taken a number of decisions where extra resources have become available. We've taken a number of decisions to allocate extra resources to housing. We published just this week on the Scottish Government website a table. I think this was something this committee and perhaps others had asked for previously, on Audit Scotland asked for, is a table showing the additional allocations to housing made since the 2011 spending review. So I think that indicates the importance we've attached to housing. And if you look at the draft budget we're here scrutinising today, the increasing profile both from a combination of direct capital funding and use of financial transactions, the importance we attach to housing is very strongly reflected in that budget profile. Our target around housing, the 30,000 affordable houses over the lifetime of this Parliament, that's a target we are on track to meet. I say that with not a hint of complacency. We need to absolutely stay focused on meeting that, but we're on track to meet that, both in terms of the overall target and the fact that 20,000 have to be socially rented affordable housing, and the 5,000 council house target that sits within that as well. So, while we can all sit here and say we wish we had more money for X, Y or Z, within the money that this government has at its disposal, I am absolutely of the view that we have given very strong priority to housing for all the reasons that we agree are important.
So were the budget increases that have been made during the past year and have been consolidated in the 2014-15 budget, was that a response to inadequate resources, or was was the extra budget put in because you were not going to meet your targets?
No, I've already. If you look at the indicator for increase the number of new houses, that is one of the indicators just now that is showing a worsening performance. But that's because of the wider market conditions, in terms of private sector house building. Our specific government target, the one I've just spoken about, the 30,000, we have been and remain on track to meet that. The additional allocation of money to the housing budget is a reflection of what I've just spoken about, the fact that we attach huge priority to housing, so that when we have had the ability to allocate extra money, we've done so. We can't allocate money that we don't have. So when we've had additional money becoming available, we've reflected the importance we attach to housing through allocating extra money to housing, and that's what the increases in the housing budget reflect.
I mean, Audit Scotland's recent report have stated that they estimate it will be 20 years before enough homes are built to meet the projected need. Is that a figure that you would dispute then?
No, I mean, I'm obviously very familiar with the contents of the Audit Scotland report. I mean, I would broadly agree with Audit Scotland's analysis of housing demand. We all know the factors that are at play that are increasing demand for housing, not just now, but over many, many years to come. Government has got a central role to play in meeting that demand, but clearly that demand also has to be met through trying to support recovery and performance in the private sector house building. For example, we've just recently announced the Scottish version of the Help to Buy scheme, which is intended to stimulate demand, which will in turn stimulate supply of private sector house building. So, we know the challenge there, and I think, if you take everything the government is doing around housing, then, while, as I said earlier on, we can all sit here and say, I wish we had more money to do more, we are maximising the ability we've got to maximise the supply of new housing. We've been speaking about the overall budget. We've also, in recent months, made other announcements that are intended to improve supply of housing, of rented housing in particular. The announcement that in the forthcoming housing bill we're going to take the final steps to abolish the right to buy. The second time this morning I'll have specifically pleased Alec Johnson. And also the announcements around the subsidy level, the increase we've made in terms of subsidy level for RSLs and councils who are building new houses. So, taking all of this together, I don't think, and obviously I would say this because I'm a minister representing the government, but I honestly don't think anybody being fair and objective about it can look at everything the government's doing and of course say I wish they could do more, but come to any other conclusion than we are absolutely serious and determined to maximise what we can do around housing.
Okay, thanks. My final questions are around the indicator for improving access to suitable housing, which shows that for those in housing need, the target's been virtually achieved. Would you consider changing the indicator to cover a wider suite of housing need issues rather than just homelessness?
I think, apologies if I thought I said this and didn't. I'm pretty sure I said it when I was answering you about the indicators. I referred to the improve access to suitable housing options for those in housing need and said that that would be an indicator as part of the general refresh of indicators. That one specifically will be refreshed for the reason you cite, that we've already abolished the priority need distinction in our approach to homelessness. So I'm not going to tell you today, because that process hasn't been done yet, what the outcome of that refresh will be, but that is one we're specifically looking at in terms of what would be the appropriate indicator for the future.
Okay, thanks. Thank you.
In terms, Minister, of the allocation of resources for housing geographically, you know, in the North East, for example, we've got huge pressure on social housing and people with less income than in the oil industry for housing. How does the allocation of resources for housing reflect where the demand for housing is throughout the country?
Maybe let Bill answer and give a bit more technical detail around this, but in terms of our allocation of the housing budget, you know, we've got sort of an allocation process for 30 councils, and then there is, you know, the allocation for Glasgow and Edinburgh is dealt with separately, and that sits, as you know, within the TMDF part of the budget. And we have an allocations formula that's agreed with local authority, and I'll ask Bill just to say a little bit more about the detail of that.
Yes, in terms of the allocation formula that we agreed with COSLA last year for the 30 councils other than the TMDF, we looked at all the different types of pressures that lead to housing need, and the committee the group effectively identified 4 of those, which was the market pressures, the type of things that are strong in the North East, the deprivation, which leads to the need to replace housing, regeneration programs and the like, the rurality, which is a very strong dimension, and then the 4th one was actually the homelessness position, where it's not like the other 3, which are kind of long-standing, but a sort of more short-term thing. Is there a specific acute homelessness issue in particular areas? And you do have to balance the 4. So we now have a formula which takes those 4 indicators together, balances and weights them, and hopefully that means that each of those councils is getting a fair share. They do tend to balance each other out, so that the areas which are facing strong market pressures and those that are facing regeneration pressures and those that are rural areas you know, tend to be different places. So it's not as if, you know, a huge amount of money gets redistributed towards particular areas, but we are trying to do that, and specifically. The other point about the market pressures is that you know, areas like the North East can benefit a great deal from some of the other initiatives we have, which aren't part of that sort of allocated process for the social housing programmes. You know, things like the National Housing Trust, the shared equity schemes, the Help to Buy. These are things that will make a big difference in those areas too.
We can provide, I'm sure the committee's already got access to it, but we can provide detail of the allocations policy if that would be helpful.
Jim.
Thank you, Convener. Just have a couple of short questions about the Scottish Welfare Fund and also the steps that the Scottish Government is taking to mitigate the impact of welfare reform. Could deal with the Scottish Welfare Fund, first of all, which has come into operation since April of this year and replaces the social fund that was previously provided by the Department for Work and Pensions. Can you confirm what additional monies have been made available by the Scottish Government to support the work of the Scottish Welfare Fund?
The additional money made available by the Scottish Government is in the region of 9 million, I think it's 9.2 million to be precise about it, a year. Effectively, as you have indicated, what happened was the responsibility for the old social fund, so crisis loans and community care grants, were transferred to the Scottish Government, and a budget was transferred with responsibility. The budget, you know, wasn't, in our estimation, high enough to deal with demand then, let alone the increased demand that we would anticipate as a result of welfare changes. So we took the decision to top that up by £9.2 million, and the budget confirms the continuation of that.
Okay. The fund will be managed by local councils, but will be underpinned by guidance from the Scottish Government. What steps can the Scottish Government take in partnership with councils to ensure that there is the full utilisation of the money that is available, and that councils are not tempted to use that money to plug gaps elsewhere in their budgets?
Well, it's a very important question, because we want all of that money to go to helping the people it's intended to help. I should say, first of all, we have worked very closely and very well with COSLA and with local authorities in establishing the fund. It was established in pretty short order. Just to make the committee aware, the fund at the moment is established on a transitional basis. It's a fund that is delivered by local authorities, but as you say, is underpinned, if underpinned is the right word, or governed by national guidance. That national guidance has just been amended slightly to take account of some of the early experience of the implementation of the fund. But it's our intention to put the fund on a statutory basis, so we'll be taking legislation through Parliament to make sure that it is not underpinned by guidance, but underpinned by statute, and I think that's an important commitment. We're working very closely with local authorities to make sure that there is, consistency across the country in terms of decision making, while there is also important local flexibility. We've had, perhaps surprisingly, the early experience has been that the fund has been under applied for, perhaps because of it's a new fund, there's not yet sufficient awareness, so we're working very hard to try to raise awareness and make sure that everybody who can benefit from the fund is benefiting from it. And we'll continue to work closely with local authorities in making sure that that happens. And the Welfare Committee, which I've already given budget evidence to, is obviously very closely involved in scrutinising and keeping track of performance in this area.
Okay, thank you. And in terms of organisations such as Citizens Advice Scotland, I think it will be very helpful to maintain the dialogue with them, because the concern would be if people applying early in the year were able to access funds, but people who were in a similar need applied later in the year and that money wasn't available. That would be
we've got very close ongoing dialogue with organisations like Citizens Advice. In fact, one of the other things we've done as part of our welfare mitigation measures is give additional funding to frontline advice agencies, including Citizens Advice, because what they're finding, not surprisingly, is quite a significant increase in demand for their own services. So we've tried to meet some of that extra demand through extra funding. So, there's, I would say in terms of, I suppose, a kind of general comment about welfare reform and our response to it, it's not a position any of us particularly want to be in, but the working relationships between ourselves, COSLA, the third sector, voluntary organisations has been very good, because I think we're all very focused on the objective of, as far as it's possible for us to do, mitigating the impact of some of these cuts on the most vulnerable people in our society. And
about the mitigation, then, and the government has made £20 million available for the mitigation of the impact of the under-occupation penalty or bedroom tax across Scotland. And again, that money is managed by local authorities. I just want to be clear, because there is a debate around the amount of money that's being made available. This is a request that was made by Shelter Scotland, which the government has met in full, and also it is the legal maximum that is permitted under the regulations that were passed by Westminster.
The short answer to both of those questions is yes. I mean, Shelter made the proposal that we topped up. If councils have what's called funds for discretionary housing payments, the money for that comes from the DWP. The regulations that govern all of that allow councils to top up that money to a maximum of 150%, and that's the legal limit that they're able to top up by.
Of government or councils exceeding
we have no
limit.
legal route to make more money available. So the £20 million that we have provided this year allows councils to top up their discretionary housing payments by the maximum that they are allowed to do. We've also, in the last couple of weeks, given a commitment that we will provide up to £20 million again next year. The reason why I'm saying up to is that we don't yet know what the DWP will provide to councils for discretionary housing payments. If they provide less next year than they're providing this year, then obviously topping that up by 150% will be less than £20 million. But we've given the commitment that we will provide resources next year to allow councils again to top up their discretionary housing payments by the maximum that they're legally allowed to do.
So the maximum level doesn't change, but
the maximum level, but 150%, what 150% top-up amounts to will depend on your base budget. And the base budget for next year is not yet determined by the DWP. We would not expect it, we'd be delighted to be proved wrong in this respect, but I wouldn't expect them to give more money next year than they've given this year. In fact, if I was a betting person, I would say they might give less than they're given this year. But whatever that turns out to be, we've given the commitment that we'll enable councils to again next year top up by that legal maximum of 150%.
Okay, if we move on to transport, Mark, you've got some questions.
Thanks, Convener. There's been a fall in the expected spending on capital land and works and in the Queenferry crossing cost. How much of that is due to costs reducing or a slowing down of the capital works?
Let me take, I think there's two parts to that question. In terms of the capital land and works budget, Sharon may or may not want to say more in terms of the answer to this. That's due to reduced investment in 2014-15 from the point in 2013-14. In 2013-14 it covered a number of road schemes like the A75 Hardgrove, the A75 Dunraget, the A77 Simonton, Pulpit Rock and A82 and also in the A82 Cree and Larach. So it just reflects the fact that the investment in 2014-15 is estimated to be less than that. On the Queensferry crossing, which I alluded to earlier in the session, that's because the costs have been revised down. They've been revised down to a range of 1.4 to 1.45 billion, which amounts to a total savings of £145 million on the Queensferry crossing since 2011. I mean, that is an unmitigated good news story. It's a project that's coming in, as she touches wood, as she says it, on time and under budget. So that's something to be celebrated. I don't know, Sharon, whether you want to say any more about the capital land and works budget.
No, the only other thing to bear in mind, of course, is that both the M8 NPD scheme and the AWR NPD scheme should be into construction in 14-15, which will be a big boost to construction spend, albeit it's through the NPD programme.
On the public sector transport spend, a lot of the focus on that is on roads and the economic return that provides. When, as we hope, economic growth will continue to increase and start to stabilise, will your department's priority shift away from roads and onto other areas of transport and environmental measures as well as economic ones?
I mean, our decision-making as a portfolio will continue to be guided by that kind of strategic direction and the performance framework, the economic strategy that I set out earlier on. And, you know, it's important that notwithstanding changing economic climate or financial climates, we keep a discipline in terms of how we guide our decisions. Specifically on your point about, you know, transport spending, you know, being heavily focused on roads, for example. I mean, you know, clearly I've spoken already about the importance during a recession of maximising construction spend in order to stimulate the economy. But even when the economy recovers, there are other important drivers for making sure that we've got a transport network which includes roads and rail and public transport and aviation that supports the continued economic performance of the country, making sure that we are as competitive as possible, that our transport links are conducive to business investment and business growth. So, you know, our decisions in the future will be guided by that strategic direction and the transport network as a whole, making sure we've got an integrated, well-performing transport network will continue to be one of the key priorities in deciding spend within my own portfolio.
And on those roads projects that are being prioritised, has there been future modelling as to the revenue cost of maintaining those new roads?
Well, I mean, obviously, if you're talking about revenue costs in terms of the AWPR, for example, which is NPD, that comes back to the answer I gave earlier on about the overall 5% ceiling on the revenue commitments through our borrowing for capital investment. Are you talking about the ongoing maintenance of, I mean, there are particular budget lines in the budget, as you see, for ongoing roads maintenance. You know, clearly investment in new roads, you know, contributes to making sure we've got a highly maintained road network, but our ongoing budget commitment helps us to make sure that our existing road network, as well as new parts of the road network, can be properly maintained in future.
There seems to be a realignment in budgets from on motorway and trunk roads from structural repairs to network strengthening. Does that mean the focus is moving? The statement from Spice is that the budget is moving away from renewal and maintenance of roads towards things like bridge maintenance. Is that briefing correct?
I don't have the specific briefing in front of me, so because I don't have it in front of me, I don't want to say whether I think it's correct or not. I'm more than happy to come back with a bit more in writing on the Spice briefing element of your question. In terms of the generality of your question, maintaining and making sure we can safely operate trunk roads is obviously, for obvious reasons, of enormous importance. Equally important is continuing to improve key connections. So all of that is, you know, has to be balanced in the overall transport budget that we have. I mean, just to, you know, our motorway and trunk road budget for 2014-15 is £639 million. Around about a quarter of that will be invested directly in maintaining and managing the trunk road network. So clearly new connections are important, but maintaining what we've already got is important as well. But as I say, in response to the specific section in the Spice briefing, I'm happy to have a look at that and come back to you with some further observations on it, unless you want to.
It was just to say that our road network is made up of a number of components. It's not just the roads, but we have thousands of bridges in our road network. We have culverts, we have drains, we have ancillary equipment, etc. And so we break down the budget between different areas of the road network. So it's as much around a balance of the prioritisation of where that spend needs to go on the road network as the split between network strengthening, improvement and structural repairs. They're all part of the road network. It's just a way that we break the budget down between different elements of the road.
So it's safe to say in this budget year the focus is moving more towards network strengthening?
It's just based on the prioritisation of what work needs to be done on the road network and where and which bit of the road it is that needs repairing.
Yeah, final points are just on...
Alex, do you want to come in this?
Ask a specific question that just occurred to me as you were speaking there. The AWPR contracts are currently under negotiation and discussion, and I don't know as much about them possibly as I ought to. Now, when we're talking, the issue of maintenance of the trunk road network was mentioned there. The NPD contracts that are likely to be signed for the construction of the AWPR, will they include maintenance over the period of the scheme?
Yes. 30 years.
And will that be the whole period over which the scheme is financed?
30. Yeah. 30 years, yes.
Yeah. Thank you very much.
Just to move on to active travel and public transport, the indicator is showing that journeys to work by active travel and public transport is flat. I don't know whether you're able to comment on why you think that is and what the government is doing to change that.
I mean, that is, trying to change that is obviously an issue of importance. You know, we're right through this budget, you'll find ways in which we're trying to achieve a modal shift from car to public transport, and you know, active travel is clearly a long-term agenda. You know, people form travel habits over long numbers of years, and they don't change these easily. So it's something we've got to prioritise in the short term, but clearly stick at in the long term as well. And you know, perhaps that kind of reflection in the long-term nature of it perhaps explain some of the flatness of the indicator that you're talking about. I mean, in terms of the budget, you know, if you go through the budget, you'll see a very strong commitment to promoting active travel. I've already, I think, this morning referred to the increased investment which Jim Eadie has been a strong proponent of over the period of increased investment in cycling infrastructure. We're allocating an additional £20 million to that over the next 2 years, on top of £58 million that's already been allocated since the spending review. Again, you know, we've got spending commitments around low carbon transport, the bus investment fund, for example. So, you know, you will see at various points in the budget that commitment to modal shift, but also making sure that public transport, including buses, are as environmentally friendly as possible.
On active travel, in previous years, this committee and organisations who have submitted evidence have called for a total figure for a total sum of what is spent on active travel, what it's spent on, and what budget lines it comes from. Are you able to provide that to committee this year?
I mean, I think that information is already in the public domain. I know John Swinney, after the budget debate in September, wrote to Patrick Harvey setting out very clearly the contributions that are made to active travel by different Scottish Government budget lines. So there is that information there, and if that's not already publicly available, I'm sure it is, we can make that available directly to the committee. I mean, there's always a willingness on the part of government to make the presentation of the budget figures as transparent and as easy to understand as possible. You will appreciate, though, that there comes a point where it becomes problematic to further disaggregate different budget lines, because that would then have I suppose, a counterproductive effect in making it difficult for you as a committee to track it compared to previous years. So there is to go back to the theme that has run through this discussion, a balance to be struck there. But you know, the information that's been provided on active and sustainable travel, particularly the information that was sent to Patrick Harvey, I think does give a very clear account of where in the different areas of Scottish Government spend that money comes from.
Okay, and Jim, you had a little one, and then...
Sorry, just very quickly, thank you, Convener. I just put on record I very much welcome the additional investment. I say investment rather than funding in active travel to bring about the modal shift that the Cabinet Secretary referred to. But I think the point that my colleague Mark Griffin made was entirely the right one, because there has been huge frustration that despite additional money, additional investment going into active travel and to cycling, it hasn't always been possible to isolate in a single budget line what the level of investment actually is. So I welcome the commitment from Mr Swinney and the further reassurance provided by the Cabinet Secretary this morning.
Yeah, I mean, I suppose I would simply say it's not in the interest of government to hide its light under a bushel in this respect. If we're providing extra money, as we are here, then you know, clearly we want it to be obvious in the budget. So it's in our interest to make it as transparent as possible as well, subject to some of the complexities that I've spoken about. But you know, that commitment is there.
Mary, did you?
And it follows on the active travel. One of the things that would have a big influence on active travel is behaviour change. But as you've already said, it's a long-term. Behaviour change is a generational thing. And we heard in a previous evidence session that there is a view that there's not enough known about what can influence behaviour change. There's not enough information out there about what organisations and workplaces could do to influence that. While it's important that government takes the first move, it's also important that there's that partnership working and information is fed out. So what steps will be put in place, or what will be put in place to make sure that there is ongoing work with partner organisations to encourage those small steps to be taken that will in the long run have a bigger difference?
I think that's a big question covering the spectrum of government and our partners. So I'm happy to ask for some information to be put together there for the committee to read at its leisure. I suppose what I would say in answer to that, well, firstly, just to agree with you really that we do need to do as much as possible to promote behaviour. When I was Health Secretary, and I'm sure Alec Neil continues this, I was very keen to see I've just been given some information, so I can share it with you in a second. very keen that the health service saw itself as an organisation that wasn't just there to treat people when they were ill, but was there to promote good health. So we had the strapline, the health service, a health promoting health service. And you know, that commitment manifests itself in a variety of different ways. So, you know, the health service promoting cycle to work schemes for their staff, healthy eating in hospitals and health centres, all that kind of thing. So I think that kind of attitude and that mindset is important right across the public sector. There is a wealth of information here in terms of some of the things that are being done to promote behavioural change, particularly in the shift to a low-carbon economy. I think rather than sit here and read it out to the committee, it probably would be more useful to you if I provided this in writing.
Thank you.
Anyone else got any final questions for the Cabinet Secretary? No? Okay. Cabinet Secretary and officials, thank you very much for the evidence you have given today, and I temporarily suspend the meeting to allow the witnesses to leave the room. Okay, if we can resume the meeting. The fourth item today is to take consideration of a new petition, petition number 1481 on blacklisting in Scotland. This has been referred to the Infrastructure Committee by the Public Petitions Committee because this committee, as you know, is leading on the Procurement Reform Scotland Bill, and this issue is tied into matters to be considered in the bill scrutiny process. So does anyone have any comments they'd like to make on this petition? Yes, Mark.
Thank you, Convener. The petition follows up from work that's been carried out across the UK and highlighted this is a serious issue and a threat to workers who have carried out political activities which could have affected probably anybody at this, any member of this committee through their working life, and it's good to see that come to the Parliament. I think it would be worthwhile asking for the organisations who have submitted the petition to come and give evidence through our deliberations on the Procurement Reform Bill.
I'm not sure we can ask every single one of them, but if the representatives, we have got a session on this aspect of the procurement bill, so I'm not sure we could invite every individual one because we'd need a panel, you know, of a broad spectrum. But you know, that's certainly in the work programme for the procurement bill. So, is everybody content then that we address this petition as part of the committee's scrutiny of the procurement reform bill? Okay, that's agreed then. We now move into private as agreed earlier in the meeting.